Welcome to Script Triggers Unleashed. I'm Heather McCue. Some of you may know me. I'm a longtime member of the FileMaker community with all certifications from 7 on. See how long it takes for the next one to come around and how long it'll take me to take it. It's become one of those things where I'm a little reticent to take the next exam because every time I think, what if this time I fail? Because I've had a success record of never failing. And I know a lot of people do fail the first time. Not all great test takers. I've just gotten really good at this one test in my life. But I will muster up the courage when the time comes. I was also recently certified in UX from SMU. Very excited about that. And I proposed this session because not that long ago, a few months back, I got a Slack message from one of the FileMaker engineers on my team asking me what script trigger should I use that does this thing that doesn't exist, right? And of course, the answer was you use a combination of script triggers to do what this individual wanted to do. There is no script trigger that says you're re-entering this mode after having exited it before. Then it occurred to me, this guy's a FileMaker engineer with over 20 years experience. And why is he asking me about a script trigger that doesn't exist? And I thought, maybe there's still a need, even for those of us who are seasoned developers. Switch classes here. Not looking through 30 lenses. Or 30 lenses it is. Okay. So first, at the most basic level, we want you to understand what script triggers are, what they do, why we want to use them. So the basics of what, why, where, and who. Raise a hand, how many of you are familiar with script triggers? Okay, how many of you love script triggers? How many of you find them to be the bane of your existence? Okay.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that.
Depends if I did the solution or not.
Next, flexibility breeds complexity, so we'll get a little more familiar. And last, we'll pursue a more sustainable relationship. All right. Okay, now, buckle up. We have a lot to cover. Even for those who are familiar with script triggers, I hope to bombard you with information here. So, what is a script trigger? What does it do specifically? A script trigger is a predefined action which, when triggered, a specified script will run, and it will run with the predefined parameter that you've provided it. So a script trigger is simply a predefined action in the form of a script that runs when triggered by its applicable event. And by the way, there's 25 different script triggers, script triggering events, but we'll get to this in a moment. So when triggered, the script runs using its predefined parameter. Now, the impact or ramifications of this may seem obvious, but it's worth mentioning that this is where some of the magic happens. And the magic is because your script and its parameters are technically speaking hard-coded. You're not going into layout changing it dynamically, okay? But the parameter that you predefined won't actually be evaluated until the script runs. So that means you can take advantage of this by defining a parameter to take advantage of its real-time evaluation, and your predefined actions can actually behave quite dynamically. For example, I might have a script named on layout enter, and I do, that I use to ensure certain layout specific conditions, okay? So I would select this script when attach it to an on layout enter script trigger on a new layout. And I might provide a parameter similar to this one. And I'm checking for a few things. Basically I'm using my layout name to define what the parameter is that's going to be sent to this simple script trigger script. So a parameter of either form, list, or report would have been provided to this on layout script, which looks something like this. Basically, if it's a list, it's going to put it into list view. If it's also a report, it's going to do a specific report sort subscript. If not, it's going to run a different kind of sort that's meant for lists. Otherwise, it's going to view as form, size to fit. Now, there are a number of things that a script trigger can't be used for. And if we have time at the end, we'll talk about those some more, or we can talk offline. So why use the script trigger? We want to deliver consistent behavior, and script triggers give us a way to do that, similar to my on layout enter. Make sure all lists are working the same, make sure all form views are working the same, reports, etc. You can use them to enforce access constraints. We do this with on enter, on modify, those types of script triggers. And I love this one. We can make the user experience better by providing anticipatory enhancements and shortcuts that assist the end user. I have a really fun example of that one. Reduce their load, make their job easier. Anyone can use script triggers, but should they? Do any of you know someone who shouldn't be using script triggers? Or maybe someone who shouldn't have used them the way that they use them? Maybe someone who modified a script that you use in a trigger? Ooh. Maybe someone who dropped a subscript into something that runs with a trigger and didn't tell you? Okay. So as beneficial as script triggers can be, they also have the potential of becoming the proverbial double-edged sword. And I don't want you to be sorry what you asked for, so let's keep learning. So where can we use them? This is real basic here. What I mean by where can I use them is from what context do I attach a script trigger? What can I attach a script trigger to? I can attach it to a file. I can attach it to a layout, or I can attach it to an object. By object, I mean layout object. That includes all kinds of layout objects. And for which modes can you define a script trigger to run? They differ depending on the context. So for layout specific triggers, we can select browse, find, and or preview. For objects, browse and find, but modes don't apply at the file level. Now, incorporating mode-specific behaviors into your scripts increases your options from 25 to 52. So think on that for just a moment. So there's a simple truth I'm sure you're all familiar with. It goes something like this. Flexibility breeds complexity. Complexity begets confusion. Confusion fosters frustration. And frustration is fertile ground for failure and doubt. However, understanding reduces complexity, spawning confidence and success. That's where we want to go. Okay, so up to this point, I've shared my opinion. And if I haven't said it already, and you're not real adept at combining script triggers and such, they can rock your world if you get it right. They can also really screw you if you don't. But not to worry. So in this next segment, I'm going to explain the various events organized into what I found easy to remember groupings of the types of event triggers that exist. Something logical for those who have trouble keeping them straight. So you already know that there are 3 different places where you can add and define them in your FileMaker files. And I may have mentioned that there's 25, 52 possibilities, so don't worry. Let's move on. So the first group is what I call on open close. And you may notice something similar about each of these options. Have one thing in common. Anything that starts with on and ends with open, or starts with on and ends with close, has to do with window. The only things you can open and close are windows. And those are file level script triggers. Next group, simply on enter exit. These include on layout enter, on mode enter, on object enter, and of course they're all on enter. These apply to both layout, mode, and objects. And of course we have the corresponding on layout exit, mode, and object exits. So what is an object? An object consists of, well, anything you can attach a trigger to. No, anything that is on your layout is an object, and you can attach a trigger. Now, whether that trigger will do anything or not depends on what the actual object is that you've attached it to. You can attach it to a field, but if that's a field that doesn't allow entry, that trigger is really not going to do anything because no one's ever going to enter it. They're not going to be able to. You can attach a trigger to a button on a button bar. You can attach a trigger to a portal. You can attach a trigger to the button bar itself. You can attach triggers to popovers. And that's kind of cool because if you, using certain triggers, you can actually prevent an action from happening. So I know at least one, probably a dozen systems where we've used a popover to collect some information. But once they've started entering the information, we don't want them to leave until they finish. Now, if they didn't enter anything at all, they can go on their merry way. But as soon as they put that first bit of information, we've created something somewhere already. And if they're going to cancel, we need to cancel elegantly and do the right thing. So we put an on object exit trigger on that popover, so they can't just click out of the popover unless they've completed it or unless they haven't started it yet. So that's a pretty powerful tool to be able to apply, and it's applied to that object specifically, meaning that it can work differently for any number of popovers that you have on the same layout or on different layouts. Now, the complexity is the flip side. You've got to apply it to each object separately. So you've got the flexibility, but there may be more work involved. However, if you write your scripts in an organized way such that maybe you have one on popover exit script, then you can feed in a parameter that says, this is which popover I am. This is where I am, whatever you need to cover your circumstances. The next group is on change. So basically, if it ends with change, it's an on change. But there are a few others, like on panel switch and on external command received. Personally, I consider those a change. It's not named on panel change, but it could have been. Logically, it's the same thing. And on external command received, you could argue that that's a category of its own, but that would require a 6th grouping. And not only that, it really does represent a change. In this case, it's a change of information. You've been sent a message that you might or may not need to respond to. So these are our on change. Again, layout size view, object AV view, object AV player, and file AV player, which you might guess by their naming, one is attached at the object level, one at the file level. On panel switch, and by the way, panel switch applies to both tabs and slider panels and on external command received. So a layout size change might be something you'd use in a mobile app, or literally a window size change. Maybe when the window size changes, you don't want that to happen, you can snap them back. Or maybe you want to switch layouts, similar to what you might do on a mobile device, depending on your solution and options. View changes simply, are we moving from view to list, table view? And your AV player, your panel switch, like I said, applies to both tabs and slider panels, and external commands. A subset of the on change triggers are, just a breakdown. A subset of the on change would be on keystroke. I think on keystroke is also a change. It's an action that you're making, but it's a change in behavior. Now this can be on object keystroke or on layout keystroke. And I have a couple of good examples of that. Along similar lines, the mobile version would be on gesture tab. So my oversimplification of all this, these are all on change script triggers. And they apply to object layout and mobile gestures. So my example for on layout keystroke and on object keystroke, I want to share with you. And I will actually, I hope, show you the actual scripts and the triggers themselves a little bit later. We have a client who has a payroll department with multiple payroll clerks who handle paper timesheets. Now, we are also converting them over to a whole online e-time system, but in the meantime, they still have a lot of paper. So they take that paper, they put it in the scanner, and then it comes up on their screen, so they should be able to key in the numbers that they need. But they don't. They still hold that piece of paper in their hand until they're done. So their left hand is occupied. And they've got really, really good at the 10 key pad. So they don't want to tab. Ever. They want to use their arrow keys to tab. Well, arrow key isn't one of the options that you can attach in your tab order or to your objects. So we use an on layout keystroke so that they can tab forward and backwards by using their keystrokes. We also use the on object keystrokes so that they can tab up and down through repeating fields. One of the expense reports that they enter is mileage. But somebody will put in every block of mileage, every segment of mileage separately, is what they're required to do, which means they may have 10 entries for the same day. I drove 3.1 miles, then I drove 2.5, then I drove 8.6. Those all have to be put in separately. But rather than putting a separate expense line for every single one, we've given them a repeating field. We sum it up, and if they need it, they go to their mileage field, using their arrow key, of course. But if they need to put in a second entry, they right arrow again, it opens the popover and puts them in the second repetition of the mileage field. And then they arrow down to go to the next and the next and the next, and then they left arrow to get out and down to go to the next row. And it's all done within the right hand's reach without stretching. Without script triggers, could not have provided them with that. They thought it was pretty cool. They also thought it was real easy. But that's not. Okay. Next group, on record. So obviously on record load, on record commit, on record revert, and the on records are all added at the layout level. They're not file level, they're layout level because they're not object specific. they're record specific. Your record loads with your layout. Your on object data, you'll see a couple that existed in the on enter on exit group before. They also exist here. And the reason I've separated these is because they're pretty important. So on object enter, when applied to a field, basically translates to on field entry. That when you enter the field, that is the triggering event that's going to run your script. On object modified. As I mentioned earlier, though, on object enter can be applied to other objects like portals, popovers, etc. Someone can actually be allowed to click a button and then it will behave like they're not allowed, like it didn't work, because that button opens a popover that they can't get into. So watch for that. On object validate, on object save, and on object exit. Until script triggers came along, I don't think I realized that there were so many different things happening every time I entered a field and left a field. Particularly if you've made a change. Because what's not shown here, and we'll see that soon, is you also have the on record load. You have on the on record commit, which also happens within here too, in the sequence of things. So you enter the field, then you edit it. When you try to exit the field, it's going to try to validate it. Only if it validates it, will it save it. And only if it saves it, will it then actually let you exit the field. You ever put in a date that's in the wrong format? And it won't let you? And you have no option but to revert or fix it. Same thing. And you can create that same behavior with your script triggers. What this means, though, you have the ability to attach every single one of these kinds of script triggers to the exact same field, which can be really great or not. So to recap, the groups that I use, kind of keep them in my head: on open close, on enter exit, on change, on record, and on object data. Now that you've got the 5 groups of triggering behaviors totally memorized, including the 25 objects that go under each one, let's talk about the essential factor of timing. There's actually more than one type of timing that you need to keep in mind when using script triggers. So when, might you ask, when exactly will the triggered script actually run? Because everybody knows the answer, right? All the time, without looking. Okay? The answer is, it depends. Which makes me feel like the mom that I am, the grandma that I am. So actually, there's 2 types of timing. The first is what I refer to as relative timing. Is the script that you've defined going to run before or after the triggering event? And this is one of the most confusing things about script triggers for most people. I hope to help you with that. No guarantees, but I'm going to do my best. The other type of timing is the sequential order of operation, or in other words, when multiple triggers are at play, which one runs first? Now, you might have gotten a clue from our previous slide. We were looking at all the different things that can happen with your data. It wouldn't make much sense for the on-object save trigger to run before the on-object validate, or for the validate to run before the modify. It wouldn't know what you've modified in order to revalidate it. But I'm getting it. So, are your triggers protective or preventive? They're one or the other. This is not a FileMaker reference, by the way. It's just my own reference. I consider them either protective or preventive. No, I've used the wrong word there. Protective or responsive, sorry. They're protective or responsive. It's protective and preventive are the same thing, aren't they? Okay, well, that's what happens when you look at this at 3 o'clock in the morning. Okay, so if they run before the triggering event, they're protective. And the reason for that is because the triggers that run before an event give you the option to cancel and to prevent that event from happening. Scripts that run after can only be responsive to the event. They can't prevent it because the event's already occurred. Now, don't try to read all of these. What follows is my own special logic for differentiating protective versus responsive. So beginning with the 25 script triggers, organized by the context of where they're applied, we apply a little color coding and move them into their separate groups, triggering groups. And you'll notice I've got some white and some blue. So the white ones happen after an event, so they're responsive, and the blue ones are protective. Let's take a closer look. On open and close. On first window open and on window open, basically it's on window open first or otherwise, can only happen after the event. FileMaker can't guess or read your mind about what window you might open. Now a script can. A script, you say, hey, open this window, and the script says, I don't know if I'm going to let you. That's different than a trigger. A trigger is responding to an actual event that you've requested, but it doesn't know you're going to select new window. Can't do that. If it can, we haven't heard about it yet. But anyway, so on open assumes the event has already occurred. The window has already opened. But before an event, before closing a window, that we know you've requested, you're already in FileMaker. That on first window open, you can't run anything before FileMaker actually has some context, right? So if you think about it that way, it makes more sense. FileMaker doesn't know where you are or anything other than who you are at that point. So it can't possibly run something before that. But when you request to close a window, it absolutely can decide whether or not it's going to let you do that. Like, let's say you've opened a card window and you did not leave yourself an exit button. There is no way to get out of that other than force quitting. You can't, it's just not going to let you. Similar thing here. If you don't want them to close a window, similar to my popover example, you've opened a card window. You don't want them out of that before they finish what they've done or cancel properly using whatever script you've built to get them out cleanly, elegantly, as we like to say, then don't let them out. The way that you do that is you return a script result. You're still going to run the exact same script. But when your script runs, you're going to perform a test, whether they can stay or go. And if you're not going to let them do whatever action it is you want to prevent, you exit script with 0, false. That action will not happen. Now, whether you want them to know why it didn't happen is up to you. Do you want to show them a dialogue beforehand so that they understand that it's not that they tried to click and it just didn't click? Because it happens so fast they won't know it. They'll just think that their mouse is broken or something, right? So be careful about that if you want your users to stay happy. Okay, so that's the explanation for before and after there. Our on, enter, exit, very similar. The on layout enter, mode enter, object enter, those all are triggered and run after the event has happened. So after you've entered the layout, then it's going to do the right thing. It wouldn't make sense if our on layout enter script changed you to list view and resized if you weren't on that layout yet. If you were on a report layout and you were moving to a form layout, it wouldn't make sense for the on layout enter to base its behavior on the layout it's on currently. it should be based on the layout it's going to. So your on enter are all going to occur after the event. But similar to our window, we can decide whether or not we're going to let them go away. Are we going to let them exit the layout? Are we going to let them exit the mode? Are we going to let them exit the object? Maybe not, if they didn't get it right. That can be very irritating as well, so be careful in how you apply that object exit. On change, there's only one that runs before the event when it comes to your change, and that's the on-panel switch. And similar to your layout change, you've requested a change. You've requested, I want to go to this tab, I want to go to this panel. And you can decide in your scripting and based on your parameters, whether or not you want the user to be able to do that or not. Everything else here happens after. And it wouldn't make sense if you think about it for an on-layout keystroke to run beforehand. Again, it can't read your mind. My husband always says the user is not named clairvoyant. I'll tell him you laughed. Our next group, the on record. The only one that occurs after, in this case, is on record load. Same logic. It can't know what record you're going to until you've gotten there. It can't know what conditions exist on the record you're going to until it's on that record. Even if you fed it a go to record number 8, you're going to plug that into your nav. If your script is responding based on conditions in that record, how does it know until it gets there to read that record, right? So the on record load happens after, always. But on record commit and on record revert, those are things you can prevent from happening. And that's where some of the real power comes in my opinion. These are ones I use every day in multiple systems, in multiple places. We work on a lot of systems that are protected. They have a lot of protected data in them. We have just the examples I gave, a payroll system or an accounting expense entry system. You don't want somebody modifying fields after the invoice has been paid. You don't want someone editing the time, the hours that were entered on a timesheet after it's been approved. You can do this in other ways. You could, use FileMaker permissions and security fabric, and you could hard code fixed rules that will never change. Never. But I don't think any of us who've done this for a while know that that's not your most efficient route for things that change. On this layout, the rules are this, and on this layout, you didn't get there unless you were part of this department, and therefore your rules are different. If you need flexible rules, you have multiple roles of people using your systems, something that you can apply at the object level. I can get into this field if, or I can modify this field if, are incredibly powerful tools to have. Use them all the time, and that I'm definitely going to show you that. I will say, stepping back a moment, I wasn't sure about the on-object revert. I don't do a lot of reverting, and users don't revert on their own typically, but I do have one place where I've found it helpful, so we'll take a look at that a little bit later. Okay, so on your data objects, the things that happen after, again, if you think about it as, can FileMaker read your mind and know that you're going to do this before you do it? Can it know that you're going to click in this field instead of that field? Probably not. It can know where you're going to tab, but tab order isn't one of those things we can look up like with a get or something, right? So really, we don't have a way to do that or to program that. So no, that doesn't make sense. It also isn't going to know if we're going to modify something until we actually try to do it. So it can't respond to that until we do something. So those happen after. Likewise, the on-object save happens after, so it can be responsive. Before the event, the on-object validate, and again, the on-object exit. We can prevent validation, which will prevent saving, which will require the user to fix what they've done wrong. And we can prevent them from leaving an object. We can prevent them from leaving a portal after they entered it if we really wanted to mess with them. No, I would do that. I don't think I would ever do that. Okay, then there's sequential order. For this segment, I'm going to focus on the sequence of data and layout scripts specifically, because these are, in my opinion, the most impactful. So we're not going to talk about where your AV changes come in and that sort of thing. I will be posting by the end of next week a separate Script Triggers Unleashed sample file that will have examples of all the triggers I've talked about, because I'm going to run out of time and I won't be able to show you everything I want to. And I have clients who've been very demanding this past month, so. But there is a link. The most recent version of this presentation will be uploaded immediately after this session. So it will be, the PDF of it will be available to you with a QR code link, and you can follow up on that by the end of next week. And you will find the sample file. And you'll find the sequential, you'll find all of the script triggers in there, including their sequential order, their context, their mode options, everything you want to know. No one at FileMaker seemed to think about creating a script trigger database, so why not? Okay, so your sequence of actions for layout triggers go like this. On layout enter, that makes sense because that's the first thing you do. You've entered the layout and you've entered a mode and you've loaded a record. Well, assuming you're in browse mode. See that whole it depends answer I gave you earlier? Okay. On layout size change. On view change. So on layout size change obviously happens after you already have a record loaded, because you can't half load a screen, right? You can't half go to a layout. You can't go to the layout without something loaded, even if it's 0 records. Then you're on layout keystroke, and this asterisk there is for the on gesture tag. And then you get your external command, on record commit, and finally on mode exit. Yes?
Can you define what a layout keystroke is?
That's literally that you have typed something on your keyboard and you're not in a field necessarily. You're not in a field, but you're on a layout and you hit that key. So in the example I gave, you've entered a new expense record and you hit your arrow key, it takes you to a specific place.
Could any key not be considered a layout key if they're not on? There's always certain keys.
Yes, it can be any key. It can also be combinations of keys. So you can, there are calcs for that, and that will be a calc for the on layout keystroke triggers will be in the sample file. So again, if you think about these logically, they kind of make sense, because think about what's going to happen, what's FileMaker going to do. Speaking of things that happen in a certain sequence, someone whose name might have started with Andy told me once that the very first thing that loads on a layout, when a layout loads, are your hide conditions. Because it has to know what it's supposed to show or not, right? And so this is a totally non-script trigger related tip, but you can use a hide condition to load a global variable when someone enters the layout or goes to a particular tab or panel that you want to be active. So you can put a hide condition on an object on a tab panel that will load as soon as they go to that tab. Now, of course, your true result of your hide condition is 0. You don't want to hide it, but you want to use the let statement to set your variable. And then you can use that variable to control the parameters going into your script triggers that are running when you enter fields on that tab. And then you can use an on object switch, on tab switch, to clear them when you exit that tab. So you can do some fun things. Oh, yes, and on layout exit. Then your data triggers. These are also pretty consequential. I've already touched on some of them. Obviously, on record load comes first. On field entry, on data modify, obviously you're going to enter the field before you modify it. Oh, I mean, except for when it doesn't work that way. We'll get to that one in a minute. There's one exception, sort of. On data validate, on field exit, on data save, and on record commit or revert. So, hinted at the exception. You may or may not have heard this before, but script triggers don't work exactly the same. Some script triggers don't work exactly the same when you're dealing with a checkbox or radio formatted field. Who in here has run into that? How many of you have been bitten by that? I first ran into this when I thought, hey, script triggers are going to help me with audit logging. Now, I've done this before. Back in the days of FileMaker 5.5, I built an audit log that literally, when you entered the layout, a script ran. Of course, I couldn't use a trigger then. I had to have it all in my navigation, but a script ran that literally canvassed every field on that layout and captured its value. And the only way you could exit that layout was from a button that said you're no longer editing, right? You could exit, and it would do the same thing. And then it would compare them all, and it would create records for everything that had changed. And I thought, how cool will this be? Now, I didn't have a client who wanted to pay for this, but, you know, what was that going to stop me? You know, I'm going to try this. I'm going to use a layout. I'm going to use a script trigger. I'm going to capture that value when I enter the field, and then I'm going to test it when I exit the field to see if it changed. And then it worked, and then it broke. That's when I discovered it. So here is an example. I'm going to play this little recording here. You see, we've got some checkbox fields, checkbox formatted fields, and for the DevCon attendance on the right, I've got a text version of the same field. And I have attached to each of these fields the same 2 script triggers, but with different parameters. So basically, they're just going to show a custom dialog that tells me which script trigger ran. So with that, I'm going to enter this. What does it say? Oh, and then I do it again. It's on modify. I come over here. I do it. It says on enter. Do it again. It says on modify. Well, that one made more sense because it was on enter and then I modified it. But that first one started with on modify. And then, of course, when I enter the text field, it does the right thing. It does the on enter before the on modify. Does anyone here know the answer to why it behaves that way? I just thought it was kind of okay. Just I had to live with it. And I actually discovered there's a reason for it, and it's right there. And where you're setting the on modify. It says Get that up close. Let's see it from here. Script will run after the selected object is modified when active. So the first time you click on a checkbox field, it wasn't active yet, so it worked and it ran the on enter. But the second time I checked the second checkbox, it just did the on modify. And for the record, I was no longer in that first field when I ran this and recorded this. I had been in the text field and I went from the text field to the checkbox field. So while it says when active, don't entirely believe it. So I don't trust radio buttons and checkboxes for using, do not depend on the on enter to run before the on modify. It was explained to me by someone, and I'm not going to mention names because honestly, I don't remember who it was. It may have been Polaris employee. It may not have been. But I was told that the act of making the selection is what puts you in the field.
Correct. That's what I.
Right. And this example is the first time I've ever been able to get it to trigger and on enter before and on modify with a checkbox field. So there may be something to that little line. That line's always been there. I don't know, but I'm also not going to waste the time to try to figure it out. I'm just going to trust that I don't trust checkboxes and radio buttons. I do not expect that they will work as expected, that they will run. I mean, they work, they're great. But if you're using triggers, do not expect the on enter to run and prevent something from happening. It will not prevent someone from modifying that field.
So do you do what you were talking about with your old audit trail back in 5.5? Do you do a what's in here now to a variable, then go back and has it been changed? Is that how you would do if the goal of the script trigger
If the goal was
if the
goal was to capture the value,
yeah,
I would do something that sounds maybe a little verbose or outlandish, but honestly, I would use the label for that field and I would attach a hide condition to it for the variable that has that value. And when I run the on modify, I would set something else that prevents that value from changing. So this is where it starts to get real complicated. But this is how my brain works. It's like, okay, I'm going to do this, but then I got to prevent it from doing that, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I would actually use the hide condition and a variable to capture that value beforehand, which isn't, I mean, unless you have 1,000 things on your layout, isn't going to add anything to your load. And it's only going to be called if, in fact, you need it. Well, it's going to be called when the layout loads because it's going to load the variables. But honestly, it's been a long time since I've seen a layout where that would be a problem. But you get the idea. But yes, I would find another way to capture the value before. And of course, where it becomes a problem is when I am in the regular practice of using an on object enter to prevent someone from entering the field. And if it doesn't work on a checkbox or a radio button and it's already changed, then what do I do? Well, I'm going to show you. I have a magic script for that. And this will be in the copy that you can download, I assume, from somewhere in the session afterwards. And you can also stop by our booth on the 3rd floor and pick up a postcard that has the QR code on it. Or you can just visit harmonic-data.com and follow our Engage page to get the follow-up information where I have the sample. Okay, so let's look a little closer at this. I have a theory. I was not the best student when I was a teenager. I preferred going to the beach to going to my sophomore classes. So my high school counselor scared the bejeebies out of me at the end of my sophomore year. I thought I was never going to graduate. Like, I blew it. So I overdid it so much that I ended up graduating at the semester of my senior year, just a couple months after I turned 16, which was way too young. But I have since learned the value of learning. And so I like things to be logical. I consider myself a gears and pulleys kind of gal, which is why I love FileMaker and scripting. I just have to think about what needs to happen, what order makes sense, and it just all makes sense to me, like another language that I just happen to speak. So I find that very cool. I'm also a problem solver. So I like to understand the logic. That helps us dispel the complexity. So I'd like you to think about your own experiences and scenarios. Based on those experiences, describe some applicable scenarios. Obviously, you're not going to do this right now, but when you get home, try this exercise. Then using examples from your experience for each scenario, define what success looks like. We call that the happy path, okay? Define the expected behaviors and outcomes that are required for a successful outcome. And when appropriate, it's also helpful to describe what failure looks like, okay? Then using your zone example, map out the logic. Describe the context and the expected order of events. Like I said, like script steps. What's the order of what's supposed to happen here? What you're expecting. Include the user interactions, triggering events, and how the triggered script is expected to behave. And if you do this exercise, I'm guessing maybe just 2 or 3 times, you'll have a pretty confident handle on using script triggers and even combining them. So I'm going to give you an example. The scenario is an expense has been paid. If an expense has been paid, an AP clerk can copy the field content of a message, but they cannot modify it. Okay, that's a pretty common sort of thing, right? We want them to be able to edit it because they got to copy the address. We don't want them to edit the address because they don't own the address, right? All right, so a success path might look like this. An AP clerk is able to enter the field and select and copy without issue, regardless of status. And a bookkeeper can do the same, but they're also able to edit a paid expense so long as it hasn't been synced to QuickBooks yet. There's an extra condition. This is a fail if AP can edit comments in a paid expense. Or they can no longer edit an unpaid expense. Sometimes we fix one thing and we break something else. So you want to test for that kind of thing. All right. Or if a bookkeeper can't edit comments in a paid expense or is able to edit a synced expenses comments. All right. So basically we've taken what they can do and we've turned it into what the results should be and what the opposite would be. Or what might we break while we're building this? So the events and interactions that I've shown here are essentially the steps of a test plan. So what's a user going to do to test this? Be specific. Details matter. Then for reference, it's a good idea to make note of the context, the layout, other relevant factors that are involved. Then we test our theories on how to make it work. So got my information over on the right. So first option we tried was an on-object enter. We tried attaching it to the line items portal. And we discovered that that works, except it also prevents us from scrolling that portal because we can't enter the, well, that's great if there are only so many rows of data. But if you need to be able to scroll, that's not going to cut it. That's not sustainable. Then we tried attaching it to the comment field, but because it prevented entry to the field, they can't select the content in order to copy it. So that's a no-go. So we try on object modify. We attach that to the comment field. It allows entry because it's responding to the modification that was made. And because we can set our parameter to exit with a 0, we can prevent that modification from actually happening and data will be reverted back to what it was. Because our script can undo the edit. So this, I'm going to step out here so I can see it with you. This is my on object or on modify exit script. I actually include the results in the name of the script so that I don't have to remember them. And because I have a large team of developers and I don't want them asking me all the time. Okay. But basically, it has results. And number one, by the way, is just the first line of the script parameter. That's one of our custom shortcut custom functions. So basically, if the parameter is 0, it's going to undo whatever was done. So if my on modify object failed, it's going to revert whatever the user just did. And if I also said it's a popover on my second line, then it's going to perform a script called close popover. This, by the way, is another non-script trigger tip. If you do close popover on its own, and it was, it's obviously attached to a button, that button is visible, that button's going to look active. So either you need to change your formatting of that button so that the in focus state doesn't show it like it's selected, or you need to commit. So we never do just a close popover step. We always call the close popover script, always, so that the behavior is always the same. That script consists of 2 steps: close popover, commit. That's all. Super simple, cleans everything up. Okay. Then we exit the script with false, which says, hey, you're out of here. Can't work. Or the results of our parameter might be 1, in which case it just exits the script. It's good. We added one that isn't in the name of the script, and that's if our parameter is 2. That means skip the field. Go to the next field. And we use that to prevent entry to fields where, like we have in a column, certain fields that can be edited at a certain point in time and other fields that can't. And we'll use the skip field in those cases. And then else, if this script runs with no parameter at all, it's going to exit that object. It's just going to commit and exit script with a 0, meaning you can't go there. So the user will think they're clicking in and they won't ever even see themselves get into it because it will kick them back out before they've even gotten it. And I can feed this any calc I want. So next I want to talk about which triggers pair well and why. White, red, or on mode change. I was going to say or Pepsi, nobody got it. But anyway, okay. The result is we want you all happy, except the guy in the lower left, he looks like he's still skeptical. He's had some problems with triggers in the past, and he's not sure. So planning. Before we talk about planning, let's go back to because I did not add the slide for those that pair well together. So I'm going to tell you, and they will be in the sample file. Actually, they're already in it, but in any case, things that I find that pair well are on enter, on exit, and on mode change between different modes. So on the same layout, I will apply on mode change, which obviously runs the same script, whether I've chosen browse, find, or preview. It would be nice, but I understand how it would be more complex if we could have mode-specific ones and run different scripts. But because we have so much control within our scripts, we don't have to do that. We also, when we're setting our parameter can include get layout mode. And it knows what mode it's in right now, and then it can do the right thing. So, for example, we needed, this is going to sound convoluted, but this is a real life solution. And it's one we've worked on for 10 years. It's this is one of our largest clients. And they had a need to generate 1099s. They do tens and hundreds of thousands of expenses they pay every year. Some of those require 1099s to the vendors. They keep track of that throughout the year. But they've been keeping track of that like in somewhere like QuickBooks. That hasn't worked out so well for them. So now we're doing it in FileMaker instead. But that means that they're looking at multiple years of 1099 data for their payees. And they wanted to be able, from the view, imagine a layout, you're saying, I'm this payee, here are all my expenses that are on this year's 1099. But they wanted to be able to toggle between the years. So our initial interface was a UI that had a filtered portal where we were setting in a global field, which year are they looking at? And it just worked. It was snappy. It was great. But then they needed to go into find mode. So we needed to make sure that when they enter find mode for a different vendor, if they did not also specify the year that they're looking for, we need to make sure that when they come out of find mode, that year filter is the same as it was before they entered find. Except there's also an on-record load script trigger running that was messing this up. We'll set that aside for a moment. So what we had to do is we had to, as we left browse mode, we had to capture what's our value, what year are we looking at? Go into find mode, we're good. They do their stuff, but on mode change, we're leaving find mode. Again, this on mode change is going to run for, so it can capture, on mode exit. And I'm the one giving this presentation. So on mode exit, we capture whether or not they've put in the year. Basically, we set the year to what it's supposed to be, whether they set it or not, so that when they do on mode enter and they're entering browse mode, if we have a value for change the year to this, then we change the year before they know it can happen. So it all just worked. But it was a complicated combination of combination of logic that we had to really think through. And we had to think through all the different scenarios. And in the end, we decided not to do it that way. They decided that they didn't actually need to toggle, that they were okay with flipping between groups. Here we get all in, which is why user research is super important and save a lot of time. It was cool, but bottom line, point is, on mode enter, on mode exit. You can combine and collect data from here and use it there, collect it here, use it there. Same thing with on layout change. On record load, we use a lot in combination with certain navigation scripts. One of the things that FileMaker doesn't do well is show you which record you're on when you are in a sub-summary report. Because you don't have a record, you don't have a body, right? A body part. You have a sub-summary part, and it doesn't know. It doesn't have a layout option for, I am the current one, right? You're on one of my records right now. But we can do that with conditional formatting, so long as conditional formatting knows which records belong to this sub-summary. And so on record load is a place where we can define that as we move through the records. So on record load is a great tool for something like showing where you are in a sub-summary report. Planning for things like conflict prevention, naming your scripts in a way that other developers will understand what they do, what their purpose is, what they shouldn't be messing with, for example, and expect change and growth. So build your scripts similar to the one example that I showed you so far, where you've got options based on what your different parameters are, rather than creating an on mode change from this context and an odd mode change from that context and an on mode change from some other context. Because in the end, you're going to find a lot of duplication at your expense. And when something needs to be changed, something's going to get missed. So I always say, document your work, because the next developer who works in it might be you. I can remember things from 17 years ago, just like that. Steve came up to me a couple weeks ago, showed me a script, said, so what can you tell me about why you're doing this? I looked at it, like, I have no idea. I've never seen that before. We scroll up to the top and there's my initials. I'm the one who wrote it 4 weeks ago. So plan for that. Document your stuff. Use simply named scripts names like on layout enter, on mode change. Store them in the same place. Create a script folder for them and use them. And use the same same trigger scripts in multiple files. If you have multiple file systems, don't make them unique to each one. I do have one system where I have an on layout enter expenses that's different from all other on layout enters, but that's only because some unique situations that required it. So plan ahead. Manage your triggers by organizing them properly, naming them properly, using consistent custom functions with your parameters, and really think about that logic. Just like you would any script, think about, if I put an on layout enter here, but there's also an on mode change, know that when you open a new window, it's going to run your on window open script, it's going to run your on layout enter, your on record load, and your on mode change. All four. And you can find a lot of redundancy happening. So you want to also build into the scripts that run with your triggers, you want an out. If you have layouts with script triggers on them and you have server-side scripts that run, be careful. That includes your on first window open. Our on first window open script actually has, the very first line is if is server, which is one of our custom functions. We have is server, is production, is staging. So if it's server, out, because we don't need to load plugins. We don't need to check the user. We don't need to do all those things that script is intended to do. And I'm out of time. I've gone over and I'm sorry. It's all about the user. And I will share more with anyone who wants to hang out. And there will be several examples. I've got about 36 different complicated scripts and trigger scenarios that will be in the demo file.